very good morning. I'm happy to welcome you all to this very important day. The year 2022 marks one of our milestones, the 25 years of our service to the rural and farming communities of Kerala. Community Agrobiodiversity Center was established in 1997 here at Wayanad as one of the regional center of MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, headquartered in Chennai. The center was established to promote research and advocacy in partnership with rural and farming communities for sustainable agricultural and rural development. The activities are designed in such a way that promotes a pro-nature, pro-poor, pro-woman, and a pro-livelihood orientation to the technology development and dissemination. As our founder, Professor M.S. Swaminathan, envisioned, the center has been serving as a temple of knowledge in biodiversity, specifically agrobiodiversity. We stand for an eco-sensitive, self-reliant society empowered by conservation and sustainable and equitable utilization of biodiversity. We have come a long way. When we look back at this point, we should be thankful to many. First of all, to Professor M.S. Swaminathan, one of the most successful and influential scientists, a great visionary, who has been all along thinking about and working for the smallholder farmers of this world and the people who are unheard. We are indebted to him. Also, we are thankful to Professor Swaminathan's family for donating the land for this center and for the associated garden. At this time, we fondly remember Srimati Meena Swaminathan, who has been our mentor all along, and Sri Emily welcomed the gathering and to chair the inaugural session. I take few seconds to introduce you. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Good morning or good afternoon, evening. We have people from across the world. Welcome here to Wayanad. Today, as all of you know, is a special day, which is World Environment Day, and which started to be celebrated from 1973 after the Stockholm Conference of 1972. So today is the 50th anniversary of Stockholm, and so I think it is quite appropriate that here at CABC we celebrate this event. I think Dr. Shakila already mentioned how this foundation was begun, but I would like to add a few things which in fact Professor Swaminathan told me a few days ago, which is propitious events coming together. One was the decision of him not to sell this land. The rest of the family was selling it on the advice of his cousin, Dr. Krishnadas, he said, who said, you don't need money, why don't you use it for a scientific purpose? The second was, he said, the fact that Anil Kumar was in the foundation. He was an ethnobotanist, willing to come here and set this up. So Anil, thank you, and I think this is a big party for Anil as well, and not just for CABC. And the third thing was that the Indira Gandhi Peace Prize was received by Professor Swaminathan, which gave 25 lakhs, which paid for the cost of the building. So I think this tells you that you need the scientific staff, you need the financial resources. If all of them come together, we can develop a place. And before going on about the conference, I'll just say, I think one more name who we cannot forget today is Mr. Ratnam, Mr. A. Ratnam of Wayanad, well-known coffee planter and leader of the coffee industry, who was the chair of the first steering committee and oversaw this development of the center. So I'm very happy that Dr. K.K. Narayanan, the chair of the current steering committee, is with us here today. Going on to, this event, I think this conference this year is very significant in that it's the first one after the IPCC reports, particularly Working Group 2. And while the Wayanad Center has always focused on agrobiodiversity and biodiversity conservation, it is now in the context of climate change. Again, most of the people in this room know that climate change program started when MSSRF started. It's not new to us, but I think on the world agenda now, we cannot but put climate change at the forefront of any program that we work on. I'd just like to say a few more words. Based on the consultation we've been having in order to prepare the program for this event. And one of the key people in this ideas of how to get this conference together has been Dr. T. Jayaraman, our senior fellow at MSSRF, who is unable to be here today because he's actually on the way to Bonn as part of the Government of India negotiations for COP27. But one thing he said very clearly, and I think that's very important for CABC, is that climate change and biodiversity conservation is a very complex and two-way relationship. Climate change is going to affect biodiversity and biodiversity conservation, but what about biodiversity conservation contributing to mitigation or adaptation of climate change? So we are going to hear about that a little bit in this session also, I think. And I would like to just end by saying that the way we have structured this conference is really to learn from the global experience, and we are going to hear about some of that today. But finally, the strategies, the programs, the actions have to be local. And so I think by the end of the 2 days, we want to also start thinking on what next for Wayanad. But we want to learn from international views, what is the state of the art on issues relating to climate change, and from experiences across the world. And we're very lucky that even in the first session, we are going to have an experience from the South, from South Africa, so from other countries in the developing world, their issues and their constraints. So with that, we move on to the inaugural session. Our original speaker, Dr. Anand Patwardhan, is not very well, and so he will speak tomorrow morning. He has been lead author in IPCC, so we thought he would be nice to set the stage, but we understand his constraints, so we hope to hear him tomorrow. So today's first speaker, Dr. Ashish Chaturvedi, currently heading the Environment and Energy program at UNDP. Ashish Chaturvedi has a PhD from University of California. He has worked for many years in climate adaptation and mitigation, waste management, starting from GTZ, moving on to, University of Sussex, and currently focusing on policy and knowledge management on climate change. Now, before we have Ashish Chaturvedi, please give us a couple of minutes. We have a message from Professor Swaminathan, which will be played. I'll stand here and then we'll invite Ashish Chaturvedi.
Community Agro Center at Wayanad in Kerala is a unique center which covers all aspects of conservation, of utilization, from microbes to man, because from microbes to man we follow the same rules of genetics. It's a unique center. I hope on this day when we are celebrating nature's gift to humankind, we will be able to conserve and preserve and multiply this unique biodiversity. I wish in this day, I will call it an adventure of conservation. Great service, great service.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. So I think with that, I invite the first speaker for this international consultation on biodiversity, climate change, and adaptation. Dr. Chaturvedi, over to you for about 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. And it was such a great pleasure to be amongst all of you. My apologies at the outset for not being able to be in Wayanad. I really wanted to be there, but there are other events lined up, and I just had to sort of stay back in Delhi. In fact, today evening, there's going to be a big sort of launch on lifestyles for environment by the Prime Minister's office. And some of us are kind of closely involved in that event as well. But yes, I really wanted, the fundamental point remains, I really wanted to be in Wayanad in person. And Dr. Jayaraman was really sort of pushing me. But unfortunately, because of these extenuating circumstances, I could not make it. I have a few slides which I'd like to share. So I'll put them on the screen, and maybe if someone could confirm that you can see it, that would be really nice. So can you see the slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks a lot. So what I wanted to do in the next sort of 15, 17 minutes is to really look at the entire sort of complexity of adaptation. I think although adaptation is sort of necessarily required and has very strong linkages with how we develop, it's relatively more complex to execute on the ground as compared to mitigation measures. And I think that complexity arises not from the fact that things have to be done, because I think most people know what things have to be done. I think the complexity arises because external influences. So where does the money come from? How do you justify money to flow to adaptation? I think that complexity is almost imposed upon us. And I think that's something that we have to keep at the back of our mind. And therefore, sort of my plea at the end would be to really get on to doing the work on the ground using the best available knowledge and science that we have, rather than sort of be bogged down by the debates on the complexity and the sort of the call for almost inaction because how complex adaptation could be on the ground. And it's really good to hear Dr. Swaminathan at the beginning, because what MSSRF has been doing over the last several decades is essentially sort of very concrete adaptation measures on the ground. And I think it's very important to kind of keep that at the back of our minds as we think about complexity for adaptation as well as mitigation. So when we I just want to kind of start by talking about how climate change is essentially a threat multiplier. There are several pressures, environmental degradation, of course, in its broadest sense. And we're talking on the 50th anniversary of Stockholm, the first conference in Stockholm, where it all began. And we have, of course, done almost 500 environmental agreements have been signed since the Stockholm Agreement in 1972. So there have been, and which is a tacit acknowledgement, and tacit as well as like a prompt acknowledgement of increasing environmental degradation, increasing resource demand, and of course, the other kinds of pressures which all of us know about: population growth, urbanization, uneven economic development, and inequality. And what climate change is essentially doing is adding several layers of risks to all of these increasing pressures that we are facing. So, and the impacts are there for all of us to see. Of course, food insecurity, the challenges to the rural infrastructure as well as sort of urban infrastructure, the sort of changing patterns of extreme weather events, the impacts on human health. I'm sitting in Delhi, which is already in the midst of its fourth heat wave this year. And it's incessant. And we are sitting in air-conditioned rooms most of the time, whereas significant parts of our agriculture population, people who are sitting in informal sort of working environments, are actually sort of really fighting this weather day in and day out. So the impacts on health, the impacts on livelihood the possibilities of migration, I think these impacts are disproportionately affecting marginalized groups. And we have to keep that really front and center of our discussions. And I hope the next 2 days actually do that. And of course, it's amplifying inequalities and undermining sustainable development as well. So I think the emission levels are actually going to be, so pre-COVID as compared to what post-COVID, I think we're going to be back to our similar levels. And of course, the impacts of climate change are actually being felt every day, day on day, to the most vulnerable communities. This is just a slide which basically gives you a few facts on sort of very basic, the two prime indicators that we have on sort of which kind of signify climate. And these are the, well, temperature anomalies and precipitation anomalies, right? So if you look at the sort of four regions, Himalayan region, Northeastern region, coastal region, and Western Ghats, you can see that the temperature anomalies going up to 2030, and 2030 is not that far away, are already quite substantive, right? So what can the impact of these temperature anomalies, and I was recently speaking at an event where the audience was mostly artists, and they were sort of trying to explain what this really means. Just imagine sort of how even a 1 degree temperature rise of your own body freaks you out, right? So sort of you start thinking about how to take sort of measures and implement sort of whatever things that have to be done. The kind of temperature rise we are talking about is anywhere between 1 to 3.5 degrees in a business as usual scenario, right? And across different regions. And just lay it over the fact that according to the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, India ranks 66th out of 109 countries, right? Our annualized average losses from slow onset hazards, extreme events, and biological hazards is roughly pegged at $93 billion, or potentially 3.35% of GDP. And the loss of food and water security, as well as welfare of climate migrants, is sort of being pointed out by IPCC. And sort of, I'm sure, had our first speaker been there, he would have spoken about it as well. So what has been happening domestically? And I just wanted to kind of present some kind of a timeline to how things have actually been sort of panning out. And then I will turn very quickly to what can be done on the ground. So at the policy level, this timeline essentially is, so there's been actions picked up over the last 15, 20 years, and maybe more so over the last 10, 15 years, I would say. There was, of course, the National Action Plan on Climate Change was released in 2008. And the government of India also was one of the first developing countries actually to launch a National Adaptation Fund on climate change, which had several projects implemented, but it had its own weaknesses, which we can get back to later. But the fact of the matter is that the government of India launched a National Adaptation Fund on climate change. The nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC were submitted in 2015. And of course, just last year at Glasgow, the Prime Minister declared a 5-fold strategy called Panchayat, and basically talked a lot about mitigation, reduction in emissions, of course, going net zero by 2070. And one of the landmark events, which I think you might want to deliberate as you go along, is this the 15th Finance Commission, which has made massive recommendations, or a very sort of impactful recommendations, and sort of significant amount of financial resources for disaster risk financing. This is a busy slide. I don't really need to present this, but this unpacks what was there in the previous slide in terms of what were the missions under the National Action Plan on Climate Change. What does the 15th Finance Commission kind of tell us in terms of allocation of resources to different kinds of initiatives? The National Adaptation Fund on Climate Change, which was sort of supporting implementation of projects at the national level. Of course, the government of India sends out its national communication on climate change, and the National Adaptation Plan is also under discussion, although the National Adaptation Communication is currently being prepared. So in terms of what can be done sort of on the ground, We believe, and I think a lot of agencies which have been working with the government of India on issues around climate adaptation, there's a significant sort of challenge which is about sort of implementation of adaptation actions growing relatively slowly due to the uncertainty of future trajectories, and also because of lack of data, which has significant impact on the sort of potential success of current efforts. And the causes are pretty well known. There is limited data on the effectiveness of adaptation activities because we haven't done too much at scale. And there is, of course, inadequate information on climate vulnerabilities at local levels of adaptation. Now, what I'm going to argue is that although these causes are salient, I don't think they should actually sort of deter continued sort of push towards more and more efforts and more innovative sort of projects on the ground. And one of the ways I think we can do that is to not think about this development adaptation and divide. I think there is a very strong argument that all good development should actually be climate adapted. I think this is a basic point. Most of us should realize that if you're sitting in 2022, in fact, even in 2000, all good development going forward should actually have very strong, should be climate informed, should be climate risk informed, and should actually contribute to reduction in vulnerabilities of communities. And for doing that, you need to inform all your development initiatives with the best available climate information and climate knowledge. Now, sort of how can we actually go about doing it? And some of this is inspired, some of this stuff that I'm presenting is inspired by what we've been doing on the ground with state governments, with panchayats, with, of course, the national government as well. And of course, in partnership with organizations like MSSRF, as well as other civil society organizations. So the first thing is to actually, do we have a fundamental, or do we have a good understanding of the human environment interaction? I think there are significant sort of interlinkages, climate responses, feedbacks and thresholds. And do we really understand how crops and ecosystems respond to the changing climate? And how does human interaction with these sort of systems has a sort of an impact on the resilience of both those systems as well as the humans which depend on them? And for that, it's also very interesting to look at climate-related human behaviors and institutions. How is human behavior and decision-making getting affected by the changing risk profile due to the changing climate? And this holds true most sort of prominently in agriculture, because the decision-making of smallholder farmers, but any agriculturalist is actually going to be significantly affected by the risks that they're facing. We basically also need to start thinking about how is research supporting effective responses to climate change. So how are we conducting our vulnerability and adaptation analysis? And how are we also thinking about improving projections, analyses, and assessments of what our future vulnerabilities look like? Because once you know that, then you can actually backcast and see what need to be done now. And that's the sort of really iterative element of climate adaptation planning as well as implementation. One of the key things that we've realized while working on adaptation is that as important as science and sort of projections and analysis is the local knowledge, the indigenous knowledge of communities which have been sort of facing the brunt of the changing climate for years on end. And there, I think the most interesting examples of well-defined adaptation projects have come when you've been using indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and best available climate science, and sort of make them talk to each other, make them speak to each other. When the scientists come down to the fields and talk to the farmers and try and learn from them, and so the farmers also engage with the scientists, I think that's where the greatest successes have emerged. And I think MSSRF is a fine example of that, where best available science as well as communities have interacted with each other, but in the projects that they've been implementing. But I think this is a fundamental insight that if you really want to think about future vulnerabilities, and you have to think about how to address or prepare for them now, you need to sort of use as many systems of knowledge as you can. And that's where sort of these multiple systems of knowledge kind of interact with each other, and then you can develop some kind of an approach for and solutions. Well, solution is a bad word, I don't really want to use it, but approaches which can actually lead to solving some of the challenges that we are confronted with right now. So how are we trying to sort of think about bridging these gaps between traditional knowledge and climate science? And I think one of the things is about conversations. Do the scientists understand the sort of the challenges that the farmers are facing? And of course, do the farmers even care about all of these models which are being presented? And I think that's the reason why it's very critical to start thinking about languages that science use. And of course, having the humility that even the best available science has very limited applications on solving the day-to-day challenges of the farmers. So and that's the hubris that all of us struggle with on occasions. But I think the farmers who are on the ground, who are actually trying to solve their problems as they go along, they need to be supported by the science, which is sort of course, it's kind of the best available science, perfect science, but it has to be used. It has to be usable by the farmers as well. And so therefore we need to deepen and strengthen the current understanding at very local levels. We need to collate regional and local data. Of course, we have to engage local communities in climate dialogues. So what we tried to do is, and I think these are sort of, I'm coming to the end of my presentation already. We're trying to build climate resilience at local levels. And one of the things that I think is we have a massive program. The government of India has a massive program called Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Right? So how do you start incorporating best available climate knowledge, engage, foster community participation in the implementation of a scheme as massive as MG-Narega, but also as sort of potentially, you could actually blunt the impacts of a scheme like that by just standardizing it, by making cookie cutter approaches and saying, okay, let's try and sort of focus on certain sort of straight-jacketed approaches, because that's not how you will be able to do iterative adaptation planning and implementation. So I think that's the challenge that you will have to get away from cookie cutter approaches and trying to standardize and straitjacket large government programs. You need the agility, the best available knowledge to kind of inform it at local levels as well. So what we were trying to do was to strengthen the evidence base on how physical assets can support the livelihoods that are more resilient to floods, droughts, and high temperatures. And in order to do that, use the sort of knowledge which is available in communities, but also bring sort of satellite data, GIS maps, and kind of layer all of them one on top of the other to kind of inform the not only the planning, but also the development of sort of projects on the ground. So we worked with Indian Institute of Science to understand adaptive capacity and climate sensitivity of a block in Odisha, and then sort of developed sort of a toolkit in some sense, sort of a compact directory of climate resilient works that can be used to respond to the changing climate. So now sort of this toolkit was of course very sort of scientific, but then we took the toolkit to the local communities to start thinking about very basic things like construction of a field bund. How do you work on traditional rainwater management techniques? How do you link MG-Narega works with livelihood activities? And this was done in dialogue with the local communities in these blocks, in these villages, in Odisha. So this is my second last slide. Sort of what are the challenges and what are the potential interventions which we believe, I think we've learned over the last 2 decades of doing adaptation work in India. The key challenges we believe are limited institutional capacity for mainstreaming climate change and DRR into governance and finance. I think there are significant institutional gaps, and the workshop and the conference that is being organized today is going to actually, I think there's very important to bring this to the forefront. How do we strengthen institutional capacities at the Panchayat level, at the district level, at the sort of state government level? And I think by institutional capacity, it's not only about strengthening government governance structures, but also creating these platforms, what you're trying to create in Wayanad, but also we need to create a lot of these platforms in several other districts. And maybe we should actually really start thinking about district level fora, where these capacities are strengthened. The district collector's office has a strengthening sort of convening capacity to implement those activities. Similarly, sort of inadequate sort of information on climate vulnerabilities has to be sort of strengthened. And of course, interventions based on research, finance, the kinds of interventions that I've already spoken about, which require sort of better research, more finance, have to be implemented. So just to kind of sum up, I think it's imperative to use best available climate knowledge. And when I say knowledge, I mean different systems of knowledge, not only science, but I think local sort of indigenous knowledge, practitioners' knowledge, for planning, resource allocation, and implementation of adaptation. And of course, we need to invest in the future by investing in institutions that create best available climate knowledge for communities, as well as sort of the scientific community, as local communities as well. So I'm sorry if I took more time than allotted, but thanks very much, and would have loved to be there amongst all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ashish Chaturvedi, and I hope that you will come on another day, not soon. And I'm very glad you brought out this, you mentioned NREGA, because we have some massive programs for infrastructure in India. And the question is how to use it in a way not just for digging roads and building them. And in fact, many of those here will know that we developed a mangrove integrated fish farm system in the coastal region, which would be climate resilient, and it was made part of NREGA at one stage, the government of Tamil Nadu. So we need more models of things that can be put into large-scale programs, because we need upscaling in the end. I hope you can stay on for a little bit of discussion in the end. I will now invite our second speaker, Mr. Ichel Guinea, who is Deputy Director of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in South Africa. He has a degree in forestry, has specialized in agroforestry, which is very close to our heart here in Wayanad. He has been a negotiator, a key negotiator at the UNFCCC and IPCC for many years. He has more than 15 years experience in the policy sector, specifically in agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So I think that we would really look forward to learn from you of the experiences in South Africa, and welcome again. So if you could take about 15 to 20 minutes. Over to you, Mr. Guinea.
Yes, thanks so much, Professor. And also thanks to the organizers and for inviting me, and Dr. T. Jayaraman in his absence. We actually negotiate together on IPCC and also on UNFCCC. So yeah, I'm speaking from, I'm in Germany at the moment. I arrived a few days ago, but thanks so much. My talk is mainly gonna focus on the issue of the concept of nature-based solutions. It's quite relatively new, so I'm gonna speak around current policy, science, and also some of the practical issues, concerns, and risks and deficiencies. And I'll also link it to some of the risks the concept in its current form and shape poses for some of the work we're doing in South Africa. I hope everyone can see the presentation.
Yes,
and
yes,
that
yes,
I'm
sir.
audible.
Yes, sir.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, so yeah, I'll just share some of the work, and I'm mainly going to talk about the high-level policy issues and some of the debates we've had at an international level, because nature-based solutions is actually one of those new concepts that's been it's quite premature and still needs a lot of discussion, especially if we want to filter it down to a national or local level. So yeah, my talk will focus on concerns with NBS, the concept itself, some of the definition issues, and who needs to lead, who has the mandate at the national level, at the international level, sorry. Some of the issues and concerns around the current science, as I said, the risks, and then just an overview of South Africa's land sector approach and why this concept is a risk. And maybe I'll just touch on some of what still needs to be done if we want to develop this concept further to a state that it can be implementable for both mitigation and adaptation benefits. So yeah, when we look at NBS as a practice, also home locally, we realize that it's not really new, because we've been implementing nature-based solutions for centuries. So it's not really new, but the way it links to international discussions and negotiations is everything revolves around support. So in order for it to be implementable, we need to actually try and define and develop it at an international level through international policy development. Also, what we realize from a nature-based solution is that nature is not universally defined. What we see in the global south as nature, in the global north might mean something different. And even if we look at the IP-BEST definition, we see that, yeah, there's differences of classification or definition of the word nature. Because in the global south, we have more natural systems and larger tracts of natural systems than in the global north, actually. Also, the word solutions gives, and we debated a lot around this during the working group 2 and working group 3 discussions on IPCC, because the word solutions is actually not a good choice. I think for this concept, a word like approaches or activities would have been better options, because the word solutions gives the impression that a nature-based solution is the panacea for solving global climate change, and that actually transfers the burden to the land sector, and it transfers the burden mainly to developing countries, because as I said initially, is that we have larger tracts of vegetated areas than countries in the global south, because a lot of their natural areas, they've eroded over the centuries due to industrialization. This is also further exacerbated. So when one looks, I'm not sure how many of the colleagues that have looked at the recent IPCC Working Group 3 report, which is actually on mitigation. You'll see that for a lot of the modeling and projections, they actually use a global bookkeeping model that's not familiar to a lot of us, since a lot of the countries use their national greenhouse gas inventories to develop national policies. I know back in South Africa, we used our greenhouse gas inventory as a basis for our NDC, our nationally determined contribution. And when one compares the global bookkeeping model to national inventories, one can see that land emissions or historical land emissions is overestimated by about 5.5 gigatons of carbon per year. And this has a number of implications for countries with huge land areas, because it makes a case, as you can see in the next slide, when you look at historical CO2 emissions, it shows that a lot of our emissions, especially in developing countries, have come from the land sector. Maybe I can just draw your attention to Africa there, because I'm more familiar with that. It shows, there you can see about 80% of our emissions is then from the land. So this makes a case for concepts, underdeveloped concepts like nature-based solutions. And I'll also come back to it later, because if one looks at the way NBS is pushed from an international level, you'll see that it's more synonymous now with this. I call it, I've coined my own concept around it, and I've called it a mass tree planting pandemic. And for all of us that's ecologists, we know that you can't just plant trees wherever you want to. It needs to be well planned. It needs to be evidence-based, yeah, and it needs to be grounded on robust science. So, yeah, this doesn't help much for the developing world, because it actually overestimates our historical emissions and our obligations. When a lot of our countries have emitted less industrials and emissions and emissions from the energy sector, as you can see from the diagram. But yeah, this diagram is also available in the Working Group 3 report. I just wanted to use it to illustrate that this makes a case for nature-based solutions, which is not really acceptable. Now I'll move to issues with definitions. If we look at nature-based solutions, we'll see that there's actually several definitions outside of the UN, but the definition that is most widely used, even by the IPCC and other UN bodies, is actually the IUCN definition. And if one goes through it, you can actually see that, yeah, the definition is not efficient enough to cover the needs and of countries. Earlier this year, there was also a UNEA resolution on NBS at the UNEA 5.2. So now this is because initially the argument was that we need to have a definition under the United Nations and a definition that's universally accepted. But when one looks at the UNEA resolution, it acknowledges that there's still a need for multilaterally agreed definition. And also what the current move is, and also during the IPCC assessments, was that a lot of countries wanted to use NBS to swallow up already agreed mechanisms such as ecosystem-based approaches and ecosystem-based adaptations, which is actually more suitable for us because those two mechanisms focus more on adaptation as well as biodiversity conservation. Yeah, if one goes and looks at that resolution in detail, you'll see that there's actually, it indicates that there's still multiple gaps when it comes to nature-based solutions. And these gaps are scientific, it's policy oriented, and it's also linked to implementation. The resolution also indicates that when we do implement nature-based solutions as countries, it should be country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent. So one of the key phrases here is it should be driven by the country. So it should take a bottom-up approach, in essence. Yeah, so now we move on to the issue of the mandate. As I said earlier, nature-based solution was initially defined outside of the UN, and later on, the concept was used under UNCBD, which is the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and IPBES. For those that don't know, IPBES is sort of the IPCC to the UNCBD. But when nature-based solutions is used under both of these bodies, they always use it with together with the phrase safeguards. So in essence, it indicates that whenever nature-based solutions are developed or implemented, it should be done together with social and environmental safeguards. Last year at COP26, it was initially included in the Glasgow Pact, but later on we removed it, essentially because nature-based solutions still needs a bigger discussion and it needs further development. As I said earlier, it then was also discussed under UNEA, and there was that specific resolution. But essentially where the discussion started was under UNCBD as part of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And currently there's still a lot of issues with nature-based solutions, especially because the scope of nature-based solutions hasn't been defined and developed yet. But yeah, that discussion is gonna go on this year, because I think the COP UNCBD is happening. So when we look at the science, specifically the summary for policymakers so yeah, the concept doesn't appear within the working group 1 assessment, because that's mostly around climate science, the physical basis, but it does appear in the underlying reports on working group 2 and working group 3. However, because it was clear from the underlying scientific reports that there's still huge deficiencies when it comes to nature-based solutions. You'll see in the working group 2 and 3 summary for policymakers, it's not mentioned a lot of times. It's actually been relegated to only footnotes in both of these. But when one goes through the underlying scientific reports, especially working group 2, it indicates that much of the conceptual framework for NBS has mainly come from initiatives in the EU, and most of the evidence has been collected in the global north. So what this shows is that NBS in its current shape and form is mainly applicable to the global north then. So for the global south, they couldn't find a lot of science around nature-based solutions. Furthermore, they found that there's also a need for an assessment framework to look at the effectiveness and efficiency of nature-based solutions, especially when it comes to ecosystem and societal benefits. Yeah, I mean, the underlying scientific report of the IPCC also concluded that there's still substantial gaps, and there's a lack of robust site-specific investigations or studies on NBS. So yeah, so it's clear from the underlying science that nature-based solutions still needs a lot of development, especially in developing countries. And that's where the scientists come in, because we still need to do a lot of work in order for us to drive this discussions and policy development and at an international level. We have to start doing a lot of national level and local level research, specifically to inform nature-based solutions and customize it towards our own national circumstances or local circumstances and needs. So yeah, what is clear is that the science on nature-based solutions, as I've said, is still very premature, especially for developing countries. One of the major risks, I did mention it early, is that nature-based solutions has also become synonymous with mass tree planting, especially in developing countries where a lot of international funders are providing money and support to there's actually a number of countries I know where this has happened, and they do it all under the umbrella of nature-based solutions. But as we know, as ecologists, one cannot simply plant any tree anywhere. It's also clear that this mass tree planting is not going to solve global climate change. There's also a drive to link nature-based solutions to carbon markets. And I mean, I've participated in several discussions where it's actually being also disguised as, they call it natural climate solutions. But yeah, it's clear that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on nature-based solutions. There was also a move to try and put ecosystem-based approaches under NBS. But yeah, we couldn't go along with this because this would have implications, especially for funding, because because a lot of the negotiations at an international level is actually around the issue of means of implementation. So yeah, this was we couldn't accept this because there's already decisions and commitments made on ecosystem-based approaches and ecosystem-based adaptation under the UNCBD. Yeah. So yeah, so for us, it's important that nature-based solutions, rather than focusing on solving global climate change, it has to be more to restore ecosystem functions, because with this, you will get some mitigation benefits, but in perpetuity, you will have more adaptation benefits. And this is also linked to disaster risk reduction. I know the previous speaker also referred to DRR. So yeah, as I said, mitigation usually only for the first 10 to 50 years, but holistically, you will have more adaptation benefits, non-carbon benefits, ecosystem goods and services as compared to mitigation. As South Africa, now I'll zoom into some of the work we do and why NBS in its current form and shape poses a risk for the work we're doing and the follow sector. At the moment, as a country, we're already implementing ecosystem-based adaptation. We've actually developed a roadmap and a national strategic framework. And this is I think this was developed with the intention of implementing it over 5 years. So that work is already in the making. We've also, as a country, developed a national land-based mitigation and adaptation strategy. I won't go into detail where those are concerned, but yeah, we can always if there's ever another discussion on specific work that's being done in the land sector on mitigation, I can share more information with the colleagues. As I said, we're already implementing EBA. That's the specific strategic framework I referred to. And as South Africa, we've also conducted a wall-to-wall national terrestrial carbon sinks assessment. So this is where NBS actually poses a risk, because when one looks at the vegetation types or the biomes in my country, we have two main biomes, which is actually woodlands and grasslands. And yeah, the NBS, as I said, currently it's synonymous with mass tree planting. It poses a risk for these two vegetation types. Yeah, because they have a huge herbaceous component. So that is where NBS poses a huge risk in its current shape and form. And what we found in my country is that 80% of our national terrestrial carbon sink is actually in woodlands and grasslands, and 80% of that is actually in the soil. So we have a high carbon soil component. And as I said, this is where NBS poses a risk. We've also started doing a blue carbon assessment that focuses more on mangroves and other blue carbon systems. But yeah, that work, as I said, I can also share in more detail in another, in another discussion.
Mr. Guinea, could I ask you to conclude quickly?
Yes. Excuse me. Excuse me. When I start talking about the land sector, I can just go on and on. But yeah, this is just to give you an idea of where most of our carbon lies, as I said, in the savanna woodland biome and the grassland biome, where NBS will pose a huge risk for my country. And through that process, we also identified 8 principal mitigation options. We've also developed a web-based interactive carbon atlas. That's the link if colleagues are interested. So that's based on the wall-to-wall assessment we did. And yeah, these are the mitigation options we identified. So yeah, last but not least, maybe the way forward. What is clear is that we need to develop a broad NBS framework at an international level, probably under the UNCBD, but it shouldn't be too strict, but we need to develop an international level policy procedures and guidelines where we also need to define the scope based on country, local and regional science. And yeah, all this development and the development and implementation of nature-based solutions, as I said earlier, needs to be country-driven, but yeah, most definitely needs to be based on national and local circumstances. And once we develop this international policies, it will unlock support at an international level. So yeah, thanks to everyone, and thanks to the organizers once again. I hope it was useful. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guinea. And I think what you ended with, the blue carbon assessment. In fact, the MSSRF its first climate change program was on mangrove restorations in the coastal areas. And we may hear about some more programs tomorrow from our speaker here. And we definitely would like to look at the details of the South African, you have given the link. South Africa has gone beyond India and having a national land based mitigation policy, and I think we need to study it and see where we can go further. So thank you, and we want to welcome you in person on some occasion here. I would like to now go to our third and last speaker today, because Mr. Venu, Additional Chief Secretary of Government of Kerala, has come down with COVID and high fever this morning. He is in charge of the ministry, the department here, so it would have been very useful to bring in the Kerala Connect, but let us hope over the next 2 days he can join us. I will now invite Dr. Srija Jaiswal, who is part of the climate change program at MSSRF. She has worked on adaptation, on finance, climate finance, equity issues, also on monitoring and evaluation of environment programs. Currently, she is a Humboldt Foundation Fellow at Heidelberg University. Most of our speakers seem to be in Germany this morning, so that's maybe we should have come there. Okay, so over to you, Srija, if you can tell us about climate adaptation, its relevance for India, and specifically our work at MSSRF. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madhura. I have a few slides to share. Is it full screen now?
No, ma'am.
Okay, just a second. Now, is it visible? Full screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah. I'll be talking about some of the main messages or key takeaways for developing countries from the IPCC 6th assessment report of the Working Group 2. It is called Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability. It was released earlier this year. Dr. T. Jayaraman and I were also on the Government of India delegation negotiating the summary for policymakers for this particular working group report. This is a brief overview of my presentation. After discussing the key takeaways or main messages from IPCC Working Group 2, I'll talk about its main findings on the impact of climate change on food security, some of the adaptation options for the agricultural sector, and thereafter I'll take a critical look at the ecosystem-based adaptation, which is becoming currently quite popular in academic and policy discourse. But here, some of my work has already been, burden of presentation has already been reduced by the previous speaker, because he gave us a very succinct overview of the issues with both NBS and EBA. Thereafter, I'll look at some of the areas of investment which has been highlighted by the Global Commission on Adaptation for investment in adaptation initiatives. And I'll end my presentation by speaking about some of the MSSRF initiatives, which I've already been investing in some of these areas of investment highlighted by the Global Commission on Adaptation. Yeah, so the first key takeaway or the main message from the IPCC Working Group 2 for developing countries is that overcoming development constraints remains quite central to adaptation. This was hinted the same thing was hinted by Dr. Ashish Chaturvedi as well. So the IPCC Working Group 2 report prominently focuses on the intersection of climatic and non-climatic drivers in creating current and future vulnerability to climate change. It notes that the regions with considerable development constraints, and these development constraints are poverty, limited access to basic services and resources, and high level of dependence on climate sensitive livelihoods such as smallholder farmers, pastoralists, and fishing communities. These have high vulnerability to climatic hazards, and South Asia and West Central and East Africa are some of the major hotspots of vulnerability. Moreover, when vulnerability to ecosystems and people to climate change differs substantially among and within regions, and these are driven by patterns of intersecting socioeconomic development, inequity, marginalization, and historical and ongoing patterns of inequity such as colonialism. The mention of colonialism has, for the first time in the IPCC report, has generated quite a bit of appreciation from a lot of social scientists who have been insisting on its inclusion in the IPCC working group. The second key message from the Working Group 2 report on adaptation is that the near-term risk depends strongly on level of socio-economic development. The importance of pursuing socio-economic development for developing countries such as India is further highlighted by the finding that in the near term, that is between 2021 to 2020, the projected level of risk depends more strongly on concurrent near-term trends in vulnerability, exposure, level of socio-economic development and adaptation than it does on the differences in intensity of climate hazards between different emission scenarios. Moreover, the future vulnerability will continue to concentrate where capacities of national, local, and municipal governments and communities and the private sectors are least able to provide infrastructures and basic services. Another key message of the IPCC Working Group 2 is that equity remains central element in the UN climate change regime. This is because the level of global warming depends on the extent of cumulative emissions, and the extent of cumulative emissions will then determine the level of adaptation needed, and this would limit opportunities for countries for adaptation and as well as increased cost. If you see that currently the historical cumulative net emissions of carbon dioxide between 1850 to 2019 have already exhausted 4/5 of the total carbon budget for a 50% probability of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if the probability is 67%, then we have already exhausted 2/3 of the global carbon budget for limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. This would have consequences for adaptation. And moreover, with increasing global warming, losses and damages increase, and it becomes increasingly difficult to avoid while they're strongly concentrated in the world's poorest population. However, sometimes this is interpreted to mean that India should undertake more mitigation because it is a country vulnerable to climate change. And however, this I argue is a wrong interpretation of the problem because two things have to be kept in mind. It does not mean India should mitigate more because firstly, global warming is a global commons problem. Even if India takes on a higher burden of mitigation, if it is not compensated or other countries, especially the US and the EU, do not undertake mitigation simultaneously, then it would not, then the level of cumulative emissions is going to continue to rise. And secondly, India's contribution to the cumulative emissions is only 4%. Whereas if you compare, the countries like USA has contributed 25% and EU has contributed 22% to the historical cumulative emissions. In this context, I would like to mention an MSSRF and NIAS initiative called the Climate Equity Monitor, which was released last year. It is an online dashboard for assessing equity in climate action in relation to climate mitigation, energy and resource consumption. And to the best of our knowledge, it is one of the first such initiatives from the Global South that compares policies and actions of Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 parties on the basis of equity and common and differentiated responsibilities. A new concept which has been introduced in the Working Group 2 is of climate resilient development. Climate resilient development refers to a process of implementing mitigation and adaptation together in support of sustainable development. However, there are few important things for developing countries to note in context of climate resilient development. Climate resilient development does not mean that mitigation and adaptation has to be given the same priority in every country. This is because the priority given to adaptation and mitigation would depend on, like I said previously, the level of cumulative emissions the country is responsible for and its level of socio-economic development. Therefore, the balance between adaptation and mitigation will vary by national and regional and local circumstances. Secondly, the opportunities for climate resilient development are not equitably distributed around the world. This is because the climate impacts and risks exacerbate vulnerability and socio-economic inequalities and increase development challenges, which ultimately undermine efforts to achieve a sustainable development. Moreover, regions and sub-regions with high levels of poverty, water and food and energy insecurity, and vulnerable urban environments have very few enabling conditions and face many non-climatic challenges that inhibit climate resilient development. Moving on, I'll talk about the current adaptation gaps and the need for adaptation finance. The current adaptation gaps, that is the amount of adaptation required and what is currently taking place, is partially driven by the widening disparities between the estimated cost of adaptation and the documented finance allocated to adaptation. Financial constraints are an important determinant of soft limits to adaptation across sectors and regions. And currently, the global financial flows, while they have increased from previous years, however, they continue to remain short of what is required for adaptation, especially in developing countries. Moreover, whatever climate finance is available is majorly targeted at mitigation. At least around 90% of climate finance is targeted towards mitigation and a very small portion for adaptation. Climate finance is also for adaptation is also a central issue of climate justice in UNFCCC negotiations. This is because those who have contributed least to the problem are most vulnerable to climate change. And if we note that most of the adaptation finance which have currently have come predominantly from public sources, this is not surprising because many adaptation interventions in the most vulnerable countries do not provide adequate financial return on investments and can therefore only be funded with highly consensual public finance. The Adaptation Gap Report of 2021 also acknowledges that there's a tendency of private finance or private investment to gravitate towards opportunities where revenues are highest and risks are lowest. Therefore, private finance is unlikely to target the most vulnerable in least developed countries or non-market sectors. This underscores the need for continued international public support, especially from developed to developing countries, and the requirement to increase the ambition of climate finance. Moreover, the problem with private finance is that it will come mostly in the form of loans rather than grants, and these loans come with conditionalities, one of which is the insistence on bankable projects. The other is that it has onerous co-financing requirements, and it is also becoming more difficult for debt-ridden countries to access this kind of loans or to repay it back with interest. For adaptation finance, another thing to keep in mind is that the projects which can get funded or the funds which flow for adaptation finance are new and additional, rather than repurposing of the older development finance. I'll move on to some of the main findings on food security in the IPCC Working Group 2. The IPCC projections note that without adaptation or at low levels of adaptation in the mid to long term, that is 2041 to 2100, the increases in extreme events and the intensity of it would lead to risks of food will threaten food security. and the more of these severe impacts would be felt in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, among other regions. However, one important thing to keep in mind is these IPCC projections, and there was a lot of debate on this in the negotiations, that they do not account for technological changes in agricultural production. They just calculate the relative change in yield due to climate change. Therefore, it's always important to keep in the back of our mind that technological advances will be critical to mitigate the impact of climate change. And some of these have also been recognized in the IPCC, mainly cultivar improvements is recognized as one of the effective countermeasures against climate change. And plant breeding biotechnology of climate change adaptation that draws upon both modern biotechnology and conventional breeding. In this context, I would like to mention the recently the Ministry of Environment of Government of India has revised its rules concerning applications of gene editing in agriculture by excluding it from GMO classification. This should be seen as a welcome move because studies have emerged showing that gene editing applications which are aimed at crop improvement could help to adapt to impacts of climate change and can help improve crop quality and production and help to make crops resilient to both biotic and abiotic stresses. Sorry, going back, yeah. And some of the other measures which are recognized in the IPCC as effective for adaptation is irrigation. Though it also mentions that irrigation needs to be properly managed to reduce its adverse impacts. And other measures are also elaborated in the working group too. These include forestry, community-based adaptation, on-farm water management, and so on. However, it is to be noted that the success of these measures would depend on institutional and public support and would also vary by socioeconomic circumstances and will have certain trade-offs and barriers associated with them. Moving on to ecosystem-based adaptation, my previous speaker had listed a number of challenges with nature-based solutions and some of the shortcomings. Some of these also apply to ecosystem-based adaptation. Ecosystem-based adaptation, to briefly define it, it refers to ecosystem management activities to increase resilience and reduce vulnerability of people and ecosystems to climate change. The SPM, so the summary of policymakers has actually highlighted its effectiveness in reducing a range of climate change risks to people, biodiversity and ecosystem services with multiple co-benefits. However, this should be considered, this finding should be considered with a complete set of findings in the underlying report, just as in the case of NBS, which my previous speaker pointed out to, that most of the evidence for EBA has been collected in the global north. There's lack of robust site-specific investigations and lack of comparison with other approaches. Thirdly, the ecosystem-based adaptation would themselves be vulnerable to climate change impacts, and its effectiveness will decrease with increasing global warming. To give an example, mangrove systems are themselves are seen as an effective eco-based system-based adaptation, but they are themselves being threatened by rising sea levels and increasing frequency and intensity of cyclones. And it takes time to regenerate after such events, and with projected increase in extreme events, it would be the mangrove systems may themselves be threatened. So therefore, there's a need to be cautious about and not overemphasize the ecosystem-based adaptation, because there's a tendency to portray them as low-cost solutions with and low-cost win-win solutions. Yeah, and also it's not that engineered measures for hazard mitigation are not effective. They are effective. These could be sea walls, river levees, slope revetments, etc., and in urban context for heat-based air conditioning. But however, for developing and least developed countries, it is difficult to do because of the high cost of construction and high cost of maintenance. Therefore, a more integrated approach is what is needed, a combination of both green and or physical infrastructure and engineered measures and green infrastructure. I now move on to the second part of my presentation. So the Global Commission on Adaptation, the Global Commission on Adaptation was proposed by the government of Netherlands, and it was joined by a number of other countries, India and China being participants in the Global Commission on Adaptation. So it highlighted 5 areas of investment which could generate a lot of total net benefits for adaptation. These 5 areas are early warning systems, climate resilient infrastructure, improving dryland agriculture, global mangrove protection, and investments in making water resources more resilient. And some of these initiatives are already being undertaken, and MSSRF has made large investments in some of these initiatives, and some pioneering investment in these initiatives. We have already, Madhura has spoken about the mangrove conservation system and management. So MSSRF in 1993 launched this joint mangrove management approach to address the twin issues of failures in restoration of healthy mangrove ecosystem and ensuring the participation of local communities in sustainable management. And this approach was taken up by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change of Government of India, and it was recommended in their National Mangrove Action Plan. And this initiative is now being replicated across a number of states which have mangroves, such as Andhra Pradesh and Orissa. And I'm sure you'll hear more about this in subsequent days of the consultation. Other areas of investment in MSSRF have been in early warning systems. There's an initiative for fish or an application called Fisher Friend mobile application, which provides information including early warning for potential fishing zones and sustainable fisheries, and focusing on ensuring fishermen's safety as well as maximum profit for each fishing operation. Another of early warning system initiative is the Panay app, which is for advanced notification for pest diseases. One of the recent initiatives is the project which the climate change team has undertaken. It's under the Google AI for Social Good initiatives, in which the team is using high resolution satellite imagery and AI and machine learning techniques for modeling impact of acidification on crop production. This is a joint initiative with IIIT Delhi. And we have, the climate change team has also started studying acidification of the Kaveri Delta. And one of the important findings of this is that I think I'm running out of time here. I can see Madhura reaching for the mic. So I think I'll wrap up here. This was my last slide. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Srija, and I'm glad you've ended with that slide of MSSRF initiatives, because over the next few days we need to see what are the new initiatives we need to take, and for giving us the priorities from the global discussion on adaptation, the global challenge. We have a couple of minutes. If anybody from the floor here or online would like to make a comment, quick comment or remarks. Is there anybody already in the chat box, Gautam? Nobody, not yet. Yes. So there's a question for Mr. Guinea, what does it mean for the equity notion? What does NBS in its present state imply for equity at multilateral organizations and negotiation. If you're still there, could you come in?
Yes, Prof, I'm still here. Yeah, NBS, I mean, in its, can you hear me? I'm not sure if
Yes,
I'm
yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, so NBS in its current form, as I presented, is mainly based on studies and demonstration activities in the global north. So yeah, I mean, in its current form, it doesn't really suit the conditions of countries in the global south. So yeah, I think the issue of equity is also in essence then missing from NBS in its current form and state. I mean, that's the short answer.
I'm muted. Thank you. I seem to be muted on. No. Okay. Any comments from the floor here? We've had a very interesting sort of perspective from 3 speakers. Anything you would like to say? Dr. Hariharan, our Executive Director.
Mitchell, thank you very much, especially when you shared your South African experience on nature-based solutions. It will be nice if you can share those documents with us. We can, we are also in the process of developing something, and we can have some, lessons from that. And from MSSRF side, many of the suggestions what you are making, it's more than a question. I wanted to highlight here the kind of work on mangroves, the blue carbon, including revival of sea grass beds and so on. So a lot of things to learn from you as well as, and when we have, we share it with you. Thank you very much.
Anybody from the floor? Okay, yes, Dr. Nambudri, if we can give him a mic. So we have a speaker from the floor.
I hope it is not out of the context if I just raise an issue on the reliability of the estimates on biodiversity and climate change, especially because of the complexity in collecting the data and also unexpected natural calamities or forest fire, cyclones, etc. With all due respect to the chairperson, they compare the statistics to a lady's skirt. What is revealed is important, but what is concealed is more critical. Thank you.
Point. Okay, thank you. Yes, and I think he had to leave. Dr. Ashish Chaturvedi sent a message that he was happy to participate in this event. And best wishes for World Environment Day. Yes, we should have said that in the beginning. He has greeted us. Okay, then we will close this session, and we have a break now, which is both for some tea and snacks, but also to look at the exhibition, which is in the next building. And we reconvene at 11:45. Thank you.
Recording stopped.